Rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a $15 million Connecticut mansion, but inside, the atmosphere was colder than the storm. A final signature on a stack of legally binding documents stripped a loyal woman of her home, her dignity, and 10 years of absolute devotion. Madeline walked out the front door with nothing but a battered leather suitcase and $32 to her name. Her soon-to-be ex-husband watched her leave from the dry comfort of his foyer, absolutely convinced he had utterly destroyed her. He had the money, the power, and the new younger woman. He thought he had won. He was catastrophically wrong. The mahogany conference table in the downtown Manhattan office of Kensington and Associates felt like an executioner's block. Madeline Reed sat rigid in a high-backed leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Across from her sat Harrison Gallagher. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit, casually scrolling through his phone with his left hand, while his right hand tapped a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen against the polished wood. He looked entirely bored, as if dismantling a decade-long marriage was nothing more than an annoying scheduling conflict between his morning board meeting and his afternoon squash game. If you could just initial here, Madeline, and sign on the final page. David Kensington, Harrison's notoriously ruthless attorney, said smoothly. He slid a thick stack of aggressively worded legal documents across the table. This simply waives your right to contest the prenuptial agreement, relinquishes any claim to the Westport estate, and officially transfers your minority shares of Gallagher Dynamics back to Harrison. Madeline stared at the papers. The words blurred together, a dizzying maze of legal jargon designed to leave her destitute. 10 years ago, when Gallagher Dynamics was nothing but a messy server rack in a cramped, unheated garage, Madeline had worked 2 exhausting shifts at a diner to pay their rent. She had bought the very first domain name for Harrison's company. She had smiled through his temper tantrums, held him when his first round of funding fell through, and sacrificed her own degree in architecture to support his dream. And then, just before the company struck gold, Harrison had convinced her to sign a formality prenup, claiming it was a requirement from their new venture capital investors to protect the company's assets. Because she loved him, because she trusted him completely, she had signed it without a lawyer. Now, Gallagher Dynamics was valued at over $2 billion, and Madeline was being discarded. "Does it really have to be this absolute, Harrison?" Madeline asked, her voice quiet but steady. She looked up, trying to find a trace of the man she had married in the cold, sharp features of the billionaire sitting across from her. "I'm not asking for half. I just want enough to get back on my feet. I have nothing." Harrison finally put his phone face down. He let out a long, heavy sigh, looking at her with a mixture of pity and extreme irritation. "Madeline, we've been over this. You contributed nothing to the actual intellectual property of the company. You were a supportive partner, sure, and I'm grateful for that. But business is business. The prenup is ironclad. I'm allowing you to keep your car. I think that's more than generous considering the circumstances." "My car is a 12-year-old Honda, Harrison," she whispered. "You just bought Vanessa a brand new Porsche." At the mention of the name, Harrison's jaw tightened. Vanessa Croft. She was 24, a former marketing intern at his firm, and the reason this divorce was happening at lightning speed. Harrison hadn't even tried to hide the affair. He had flaunted it, bringing Vanessa to corporate galas while Madeline sat at home, slowly realizing her marriage was a hollow shell. "Vanessa has nothing to do with the legalities of this separation," David Kensington interrupted, exchanging a knowing glance with Harrison. "Madeline, if you refuse to sign, we will tie this up in litigation for years. You will drown in legal fees. Harrison has the capital to drag this out until you are utterly bankrupt. Signing this allows you to walk away cleanly. Cleanly. It was a sterile word for a brutal amputation. Madeleine looked down at the Mont Blanc pen resting near the documents. She picked it up. It felt heavy, cold, and impersonal. She thought about fighting. She thought about screaming. But the exhaustion in her bones was profound. The man she loved was dead, replaced by this corporate sociopath who viewed her as a depreciated asset. With a slow, deliberate motion, Madeleine signed her name. First the initials on page 4, then page 7, and finally the full signature on the last page. Harrison immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a final word of comfort. "Have your things out of the Westport house by 5 o'clock, he said flatly. "The security codes are being changed at 6. Without another look, Harrison walked out of the boardroom. As the heavy door swung open, Madeleine caught a brief glimpse of the reception area. Vanessa Croft was sitting on a velvet sofa, wearing a designer trench coat, her legs crossed. When she saw Harrison, her face lit up with a brilliant, victorious smile. She stood on her tiptoes, kissed his cheek, and linked her arm through his. Madeleine sat alone in the boardroom for a long time. The silence was deafening. She gathered her worn trench coat, picked up her purse, and walked out into the pouring Manhattan rain. She had exactly $32 in her checking account, a suitcase of old clothes in the trunk of her car, and no destination. The life she had known was officially over. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It matched the bleak, suffocating reality of Madeleine's new existence. She found herself in a dilapidated motel on the outskirts of Stamford. The neon sign outside her window buzzed incessantly, flickering with a harsh red light that cast long, sickly shadows across the peeling wallpaper of room 114. The room smelled permanently of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. It cost $45 a night, paid in cash from the small emergency fund she had managed to scrape together by returning a few unused designer dresses to a boutique before Harrison froze her credit cards. Madeleine sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring at the screen of a prepaid burner phone. She had sold her iPhone on the second day just to buy groceries. She needed a job, and she needed one immediately. But every door she tried to open was inexplicably slammed shut. She had reached out to 3 different architectural firms where she had previously made connections, hoping to secure an entry-level drafting position. All 3 had initially been enthusiastic, only to abruptly rescind their offers after a background check. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Harrison's PR machine was vast. He wasn't just content with divorcing her. He was systematically erasing her credibility to ensure she could never speak out against him. Rumors had been quietly planted in their social and professional circles that Madeleine was unstable, prone to erratic behavior, and had attempted to steal corporate secrets during the divorce. She was toxic, blacklisted. Her stomach gave a hollow, painful growl. She looked at the single cup of instant ramen sitting on the wobbly nightstand. It was her only meal for the day. Desperation is a cold, creeping sensation. It starts in the chest and slowly paralyzes the limbs. Madeleine looked down at her left hand. Her fingers were bare except for the faint, pale indentation where her wedding ring had sat for a decade. She reached into the zippered pocket of her purse and pulled it out. It was a beautiful ring, a classic 3-carat princess-cut diamond set in platinum. Harrison had given it to her on their 5th anniversary, upgrading the cheap silver band they had married with. "To match the success you helped me build," he had told her at a lavish dinner in Paris. Madeleine had always sworn she would never sell it. It was the one piece of genuine sentimentality she had left. But sentimentality couldn't pay for a security deposit on an apartment, and it certainly couldn't buy food. Swallowing her pride, Madeline put on her damp coat and drove her sputtering Honda down to a pawn shop she had seen near the highway. The bell above the door chimed a tinny, sad note as she walked in. The shop was cluttered with forgotten guitars, dusty power tools, and tarnished silver. Behind the glass counter stood an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a heavy, graying beard. His name tag read Arthur. "What can I do for you, miss?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Madeline approached the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the velvet box on the glass. "I need to sell this. It's a 3-carat diamond. Platinum setting. I know you can't give me retail value, but I was hoping for something fair." Arthur opened the box. The stone caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the shop. He let out a low whistle. "Big rock," he muttered. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a jeweler's loop, screwing it into his right eye. He picked up the ring with a pair of tweezers and held it up to the light, turning it slowly. Madeline held her breath. If she could just get $10,000 for it, she could secure a decent apartment, buy a cheap laptop, and start freelancing under a different name. She could survive. Arthur lowered the ring. He took the loop out of his eye and looked at Madeline with an expression of profound pity. It was the same look David Kensington had given her, but this one lacked malice. It was genuine sorrow. "Miss, who gave this to you?" Arthur asked gently. "My husband," Madeline said, her throat tightening. "Ex-husband." "Why?" Arthur sighed heavily, placing the ring back on the velvet pad. "I don't know how to tell you this, sweetheart. The setting is real platinum. I can give you about $300 for the melt value of the metal. But the stone," he tapped the glass counter. "It's moissanite. High quality. Lab-created moissanite. It's not a diamond. The stone is worth maybe $50. The world tilted on its axis. The buzzing of the pawn shop's fluorescent lights grew deafening. "No," Madeline whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's impossible. He gave it to me in Paris. He told me it was a flawless diamond. He had the appraisal papers and everything. Papers can be faked, miss, or he bought a real one, got the papers, returned it, and had a custom duplicate made with moissanite. I see wealthy guys do it all the time. They want the prestige of giving the big rock without the actual financial risk if the marriage goes south." Arthur pushed the box back toward her. "I'm so sorry." Madeline stared at the glittering fake stone. The ultimate betrayal. Harrison hadn't just manipulated the end of their marriage. He had been calculating his exit for years. He had looked her in the eyes, sworn his eternal love, and slipped a piece of worthless glass onto her finger. A sudden, sharp laugh escaped her lips. It was a broken, hysterical sound. She had spent 10 years worshipping a man who had treated her like a temporary, disposable placeholder. "Just give me the 300 for the platinum," Madeline said, her voice dropping to a dead, icy monotone. "Keep the stone. Throw it in the trash for all I care." She walked out of the pawn shop with a wad of $20 bills and a heart that had finally, completely turned to stone. The sadness was gone. The confusion was gone. As she sat behind the wheel of her car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, a new, entirely unfamiliar emotion began to take root in her chest. It was pure, unadulterated rage. 3 weeks passed. Madeline stretched the $300 with military precision. She ate canned beans, drank tap water, and spent her days in the local public library, using the free internet to scour the deepest, darkest corners of job boards. She managed to land a remote, under-the-table data entry gig for a logistics company in Ohio. It paid pennies, but it kept the motel room paid for. She was a ghost, a phantom haunting the edges of society, completely forgotten by the billionaire elite of Connecticut. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the burner phone rang. Madeline jumped. No one had this number except her temporary employer. She looked at the screen. It was an unknown caller ID, but the area code was from Manhattan. Her heart performed a nervous stutter. Had Harrison found out she was working? Was he trying to take this away from her too? She answered, her voice cautious. "Hello? Am I speaking with Madeline Reed?" a voice asked. It was an older man's voice, raspy, authoritative, and laced with a thick New England accent. "Who is asking?" "My name is Arthur Pendleton," the man said. "I'm a senior partner at Pendleton. Pendleton, Croft and Higgins, estate law." Madeline frowned. "I think you have the wrong number. I don't have an estate, Mr. Pendleton." "I am well aware of your current financial situation, Mrs. Gallagher." "Or Miss Reed, rather," Pendleton replied, completely unfazed. "I assure you, I have the right number." It took a private investigator a week to track down this prepaid line. "I am calling regarding the estate of your late father, William Reed." Madeline sat up straight, the cheap springs of the motel bed groaning beneath her. Her father had passed away 8 years ago from a sudden heart attack. He had been a brilliant but chaotic software engineer, a man who always had his head in the clouds and a desk covered in half-finished patents. When he died, he left behind massive debts. Harrison had stepped in, paid off her father's creditors, and supposedly absorbed her father's meager remaining tech assets into Gallagher Dynamics as a favor to her. "My father's estate was settled years ago," Madeline said, her grip tightening on the phone. "Harrison handled it." "Harrison Gallagher thought he handled it," Pendleton corrected, a hint of dry amusement entering his tone. Mr. Gallagher's legal team was aggressive, but sloppy. Extremely sloppy. 10 years ago, when your father was dabbling in neural network architecture, he formed a small shell holding company in Delaware called Apex Solutions. He named you, his only daughter, as the sole proprietor and 100% shareholder. It was meant to be a tax shelter for a specific string of algorithmic patents he was developing. "I don't understand," Madeline said, her pulse beginning to race. "What does this have to do with me now?" Pendleton let out a slow breath. "Miss Reed, when Harrison Gallagher absorbed your father's assets, his lawyers transferred all the physical servers and the basic software copyrights over to Gallagher Dynamics. However, they failed to realize that the foundational patent for the neural network algorithm, the literal source code that makes the software learn, was legally bound to Apex Solutions, a company that Harrison never purchased because he assumed it was just a dead LLC. Madeline stood up. The air in the cramped motel room suddenly felt very thin. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," Pendleton interrupted, his voice dropping to a serious, dramatic register, "that Harrison Gallagher does not own the foundational intellectual property to his own flagship AI software. You do. Apex Solutions does, and you are Apex Solutions." Madeline walked over to the cracked mirror above the motel sink. She stared at her reflection. She looked pale, exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, but a spark was beginning to ignite in her pupils. "Mr. Pendleton," Madeline said, her voice shaking slightly, "Gallagher Dynamics is built on that AI. It's called Project Chimera. It's his entire business model." "Precisely," Pendleton said. "And as you may or may not know, Gallagher Dynamics is scheduled to file for an initial public offering, an IPO, next Friday. The valuation is projected at over $3 billion. The SEC filings have already been submitted, but there is a massive, fatal flaw in those filings. They claim absolute ownership of the Chimera algorithm. Madeline closed her eyes. The puzzle pieces crashed together with the force of a freight train. If an auditing firm or the Securities and Exchange Commission found out that Gallagher Dynamics did not own the core patent they were selling to the public, it wouldn't just be a delay. It would be a catastrophic fraud investigation. The IPO would collapse. The investors would pull out. Harrison would be personally liable for billions. He would lose everything. "Why are you calling me now?" Madeline asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because, Miss Reed, Harrison's lawyers finally caught the error," Pendleton said. 4 days ago, during a final due diligence sweep by the underwriters, the discrepancy was flagged. David Kensington's office has been in absolute panic mode. They reached out to my firm, as we are the registered agents for Apex Solutions, attempting to quietly buy the company for $50,000, claiming it was a minor clerical cleanup. $50,000, Madeline scoffed. The audacity was breathtaking. Harrison was trying to steal a $3 billion empire from her for the price of a mid-range sedan. "I refused the offer on your behalf, naturally," Pendleton continued smoothly. "I recognized your name from the recent, highly publicized divorce proceedings. I put 2 and 2 together. Mr. Gallagher is currently under the assumption that you are completely unaware of this asset, and he is desperately trying to secure your signature on a retroactive transfer deed before you figure it out." Madeline looked down at her hands. The phantom ring was gone. The naive, subservient wife was dead. She was standing in a $45 a night motel, eating ramen noodles, while the man who had destroyed her life was days away from becoming a multi-billionaire, using her father's stolen legacy. "Ms. Reed," Pendleton asked quietly, "what would you like me to tell David Kensington?" A slow, chilling smile spread across Madeline's face. It was the first time she had smiled in a month. It didn't reach her eyes. It was a predator's smile. The rain outside seemed to suddenly stop, replaced by a deafening, electric silence. "Tell Mr. Kensington," Madeline said, her voice dripping with ice and authority, "that Apex Solutions is not for sale. And tell him that if Harrison Gallagher wants his company to survive the week, he is going to have to call me himself. And he is going to have to beg." Champagne flowed like water inside the private dining room of Le Bernardin. Harrison Gallagher raised a baccarat crystal flute, the ambient lighting catching the expensive liquid and the triumphant gleam in his eyes. Across the table, Vanessa laughed at something one of the junior executives had said, her hand resting possessively on Harrison's thigh. Gallagher Dynamics was exactly 96 hours away from ringing the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Lead underwriters from Goldman Sachs had finalized the valuation that morning, a staggering $3.2 billion initial public offering. Harrison was about to transition from a wealthy tech founder into a certified, globally recognized titan of industry. The heavy mahogany door to the private room swung open, shattering the celebratory atmosphere. David Kensington did not look like a man arriving to toast a victory. The usually impeccably groomed attorney looked disheveled. His tie was loosened, a fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, and his face was drained of all color, resembling wet ash. He walked directly to Harrison, ignoring the greetings from the other executives. "Harrison," Kensington said, his voice completely devoid of its usual smooth arrogance. "We need to step outside, immediately." Harrison frowned, irritated by the interruption. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. "David, I'm in the middle of a toast. Whatever contract needs reviewing can wait until tomorrow morning." "It cannot wait until tomorrow," Kensington hissed, leaning down so his voice barely carried over the jazz music playing softly in the background. The Goldman Sachs compliance team just flagged a critical anomaly in the SECS-1 filing. If we don't resolve it tonight, they are pulling out of the IPO entirely. The entire public offering will collapse by dawn. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison's annoyance instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He set his champagne flute down with a harsh clink, excused himself from Vanessa without a word, and followed his lawyer out into the quiet, dimly lit corridor near the coat check. "What do you mean they're pulling out?" Harrison demanded the second the door clicked shut. "We've passed every audit. The financials are spotless. Project Chimera is the most advanced AI learning model on the market. What could possibly be the issue?" Kensington pulled a thick, heavily redacted folder from his leather briefcase. His hands were visibly shaking. "The financials are fine. The issue is the intellectual property, specifically the foundational source code for the Chimera algorithm, the core neural network. I own that," Harrison snapped. "I absorbed all of William Reed's tech assets after he died. We filed the transfer deeds 8 years ago. You handled it yourself." "I handled the transfer of his physical servers and the primary copyrights under his name," Kensington corrected, his voice trembling. "But William Reed didn't hold the patent for the learning algorithm under his own name. He registered it under a Delaware shell corporation called Apex Solutions. It was buried under layers of tax shelters. We missed it during the original asset absorption." Harrison stared at him, the words struggling to process in his brain. "You missed it? You missed the core patent to my entire multi-billion-dollar company. It was deliberately obscured," Kensington defended himself defensively. "But that isn't the worst part, Harrison. When we realized the error 4 days ago, I immediately contacted the registered agent for Apex Solutions to execute a quiet buyout. I assumed it was a dead entity. Just paperwork." "And?" Harrison growled, grabbing Kensington by the lapels of his suit. "Did you buy it?" "The registered agent is Arthur Pendleton," Kensington choked out, stepping back to break Harrison's grip. "He represents the sole proprietor and 100% shareholder of Apex Solutions, a shareholder who inherited the company directly upon William Reed's death." Harrison's blood ran entirely cold. The pieces clicked together with horrifying precision. "No." "Yes," Kensington whispered, looking thoroughly defeated. "Madeline owns it, Harrison. Your ex-wife owns the foundational patent to Gallagher Dynamics. Legally, you are leasing her intellectual property without permission. Without her signature on a transfer deed, the company is entirely worthless." A suffocating silence descended upon the corridor. Harrison felt the ground tilt beneath his expensive Italian loafers. 10 years of calculated manipulation, a brutal, ruthlessly executed divorce designed to leave Madeline destitute, and he had unknowingly left the keys to his entire empire in her hands. "Call her," Harrison ordered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Offer her $5 million. 10 million. Whatever she wants. Tell her it's a settlement bonus. Just get her signature on a digital contract tonight." "I tried," Kensington admitted miserably. "Pendleton rejected our initial offer. He knows exactly what the patent is worth. I tried calling her personal number, but she's using a burner phone. Pendleton passed along a message from her." "What message?" Kensington swallowed hard. "She said Apex Solutions is not for sale. And she said that if you want the company to survive the week, you have to call her yourself." The lawyer paused, looking down at his polished shoes. "She said you have to beg." Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Harrison's veins. He was a billionaire. He did not beg, especially not to the quiet, obedient woman he had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. He snatched Kensington's phone from his hand, navigated to the recent calls, and found the number labeled Pendleton/Reed Contact. He hit dial, pacing the hallway like a caged tiger. It rang 3 times before a quiet, steady voice answered. "Hello, Harrison." She didn't sound broken. She didn't sound desperate. She sounded terrifyingly calm. "Madeline?" Harrison said, forcing his voice into the soothing, patronizing tone he had used on her for years. "Maddie, honey, it seems there's been a slight clerical mix-up regarding some of your late father's old paperwork. David's team made a mistake. I want to make this right. I'm prepared to wire $10 million into a new account for you tonight. All you have to do is digitally sign a standard IP release form." A soft, genuinely amused laugh echoed through the receiver. It was a sound Harrison had never heard from her before. $10 million, Madeline mused, letting the silence stretch out. For a company about to be valued at $3.2 billion by Goldman Sachs, your math skills have seriously degraded since we lived in that garage, Harrison. "Madeline, be reasonable," Harrison warned, the facade slipping. "You don't know how to run a tech company. You don't know what to do with that patent. Take the $10 million. It's more money than you'll ever need. If you try to hold this hostage, I will unleash every lawyer I have on you. I will bury you in litigation for the rest of your natural life." "You don't have time to bury me, Harrison," she replied, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. "The IPO is on Friday. Goldman Sachs needs the IP clearance by tomorrow afternoon, or they pull the plug. If they pull out, the news leaks. The market panics. Your private equity backers will tear you apart to recoup their investments. You won't just be broke. You'll be facing federal fraud charges for lying on an SEC filing." Harrison stopped pacing. He leaned against the wall, the heavy realization crashing over him. She knew everything. She held every single card, and she knew exactly how to play them. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp," Madeline dictated. "You and David Kensington will meet me. Not at your office. Not at a fancy restaurant. You will come to the Starlight Diner on 4th Avenue in Queens. You remember it, don't you? It's where I worked double shifts so you could afford server space. Madeline, I can't go to Queens. 9 a.m., Harrison. If you are 1 minute late, I call Goldman Sachs myself and send them the actual patent documents." The line went dead. Harrison stared at the phone, his chest heaving. The jazz music from the private room suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. The empire he had built on a foundation of lies was actively crumbling, and the architect of its destruction was the woman he thought he had completely erased. The Starlight Diner smelled exactly as it had 10 years ago. A permanent, greasy combination of scorched coffee, frying bacon, and lemon-scented floor cleaner. The vinyl booths were taped together, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed with an irritating rhythm. At exactly 8:58 a.m., a sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb, looking entirely alien against the backdrop of pawn shops and laundromats. Harrison Gallagher and David Kensington stepped out into the crisp morning air, both wearing expressions of profound discomfort. They looked like royalty forced to walk through a mud pit. Inside, sitting in the very back corner booth, the exact booth where Harrison used to sit and code while she worked the counter, was Madeline. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She wore a simple tailored black turtleneck and a grey wool trench coat. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and her face was bare of makeup, save for a sharp, confident expression that made her look like an entirely different species of woman. Next to her sat Arthur Pendleton, looking perfectly at ease with a cup of black coffee in front of him. Harrison slid into the booth opposite her, refusing to take off his cashmere overcoat. Kensington squeezed in beside him, immediately wiping down the slightly sticky table with a folded napkin. "Madeline," Harrison started, attempting to project an aura of control. "Let's dispense with the theatrics. I have a cashier's check for $20 million in my briefcase. Tax-free, liquid capital. You sign the transfer deed, hand over the Apex Solutions paperwork, and you walk out of here set for life. It's an incredibly generous offer." Madeline didn't look at the briefcase. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locked onto Harrison's. "Generous," she repeated, tasting the word. "Like letting me keep my 12-year-old Honda was generous? Like changing the security codes to my own house in the pouring rain was generous? We are here to conduct a business transaction, Miss Reed," Kensington interjected, trying to sound authoritative. "Personal grievances have no place at this table. The $20 million is our final—" "Shut up, David," Madeline said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The sheer, absolute authority in her tone snapped the lawyer's mouth shut instantly. Pendleton hid a small smile behind his coffee mug. Madeline turned her attention back to her ex-husband. "Harrison, you seem to be operating under a massive delusion. You think you are here to negotiate. You aren't. You are here to receive my terms." "You're being irrational, Maddie," Harrison scoffed, leaning forward. "You're angry. I get it. The divorce was messy. But you have to look at the big picture. You have a piece of paper. I built the company. I secured the funding. I marketed the product. Without me, that algorithm is just lines of code collecting digital dust. $20 million is more than fair." Madeline reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat. She pulled out a small, worn velvet box and placed it precisely in the center of the table, right between the salt and pepper shakers. Harrison's eyes darted to the box. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Do you know what I did when you threw me out, Harrison?" Madeline asked, her voice dangerously soft. "I went to a pawn shop. I was starving. I couldn't get a job because you had your PR team blacklist me at every architectural firm on the East Coast. So I tried to sell the symbol of our love, the 3-carat flawless diamond you bought me in Paris." Kensington looked confused, glancing between Harrison and the box. Harrison, however, had gone completely rigid. Madeline reached out and flipped the lid open. The cheap, lab-created moissanite caught the harsh diner lights. "Imagine my surprise," Madeline whispered, leaning across the table until she was inches from Harrison's face, when the appraiser told me the stone was fake, worth $50. You bought a duplicate to protect your assets, just in case you ever decided to discard me. You planned my ruin years before you ever filed the papers." Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The absolute moral high ground he usually fabricated for himself had just collapsed. "So," Madeline said, leaning back and resting her hands on the table, "let's talk about the big picture. Let's talk about the real value of things. Arthur, please hand Mr. Kensington the documents." Pendleton opened his leather briefcase and slid a thick stack of pristine, legally binding contracts across the table. Kensington scrambled to read them, his eyes scanning the first page rapidly. As he read, his face turned the color of spoiled milk. This is extortion," Kensington stammered, looking at Harrison with wide, terrified eyes. "What is it?" Harrison demanded, trying to snatch the papers. "She doesn't want $20 million, Kensington whispered. "She wants a 51% controlling stake in Gallagher Dynamics. She wants majority voting rights on the board, and she wants you to step down as CEO, effective immediately." Harrison stared at Madeline, utter disbelief radiating from his pores. "You're insane. I will never sign that. I will burn the company to the ground before I let you take it from me." "Then burn it," Madeline said, her voice devoid of any emotion. She checked the clock on the diner wall. It is 9:15 a.m. You have exactly 45 minutes before Arthur makes a phone call to the lead underwriter at Goldman Sachs and informs them that Gallagher Dynamics does not own the Chimera algorithm. The IPO will be cancelled by lunch. By dinner, the SEC will be raiding your offices. By tomorrow, your private equity investors will be filing lawsuits that will freeze every single asset you possess. You'd destroy your father's legacy? Harrison challenged, grasping at straws. You'd let the algorithm die just to spite me? My father's legacy is the algorithm, Harrison, not your company, Madeline corrected sharply. If you refuse to sign, I will simply license the Apex Solutions patent to your biggest competitor, Apexion Tech, for a fraction of the cost. They will dominate the market, and Gallagher Dynamics will be a footnote in tech history. I will still be incredibly wealthy, and you will be facing federal prison for fraud. She pushed a cheap, plastic diner pen across the table. It stopped right next to the velvet box, holding the fake diamond. You built your empire on my back, Harrison. You funded it with my sweat. You secured it with my father's genius. And then you tried to leave me to starve. Madeline's eyes locked onto his, cold, unyielding, and completely triumphant. Sign the papers. Give me my company, or I will let you drown. The cheap plastic diner pen felt heavier than a lead pipe in Harrison's trembling hand. He stared at the signature line on the transfer agreement, the crisp white paper mocking him. The Starlight Diner, with its peeling vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee, had suddenly transformed into the graveyard of his empire. Harrison, David Kensington whispered frantically, leaning in close. Don't do it. We can fight this in court. We can file an injunction. We can claim she acquired the shell company under fraudulent pretenses. On what grounds, David? Arthur Pendleton interrupted smoothly, taking a leisurely sip of his coffee. William Reed's will was probated 8 years ago. Ms. Reed's inheritance of Apex Solutions is an indisputable matter of public record. If you attempt an injunction, the IP dispute becomes public knowledge immediately. The SEC will halt the IPO by noon. The fraud investigation will begin by 3. You cannot fight this quietly. You can either surrender the company to its rightful owner, or you can go to federal prison. Choose. Harrison looked up at Madeline. She was entirely impassive. The woman who used to pack his lunches, who used to massage his shoulders after 20-hour coding binges, was looking at him with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner analyzing a condemned man. There was no mercy left in her. He had systematically destroyed every ounce of it. With a sound that resembled a suppressed sob, Harrison pressed the pen to the paper. His signature, usually a bold, sweeping scrawl of absolute confidence, was jagged and weak. He signed his resignation. He signed over the controlling shares. He signed his billionaire status away into the grease-stained ether of a Queen's diner. Arthur Pendleton neatly gathered the documents, tapping the edges against the table to align them before slipping them into his leather briefcase. A wise decision, Mr. Gallagher. A press release detailing your unexpected, health-related early retirement will be distributed to the major financial networks in precisely 1 hour. Ms. Reed will be stepping in as interim CEO to guide the company through the IPO. You won't get away with this, Harrison hissed, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He glared at Madeline. You don't know the first thing about running a board of directors. The venture capitalists will eat you alive. They'll force you out. Madeline stood up, buttoning her grey wool trench coat. She picked up the velvet box containing the fake moissanite ring and dropped it unceremoniously into the half-empty cup of cold coffee sitting in front of Harrison. It sank to the bottom with a pathetic little splash. The venture capitalists care about one thing, Harrison, the chimera algorithm, Madeline said, her voice echoing with finality. And I am the only person on Earth who holds the keys to it. They won't force me out. They will bow, just like you did. Without another word, Madeline turned and walked out of the diner, Arthur Pendleton trailing respectfully behind her. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, completely jarring sound against the utter devastation left in her wake. By the time Harrison's Maybach returned to his $15 million Connecticut mansion, the news had already broken. His phone was a vibrating block of sheer panic, flooded with texts from furious board members, confused investors, and frantic PR managers. He found Vanessa in the master suite. She was surrounded by open designer luggage, frantically throwing silk blouses, diamond tennis bracelets, and cashmere sweaters into the suitcases. The massive flat-screen television on the wall was tuned to Bloomberg News, where a scrolling red ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Gallagher Dynamics founder, steps down, mystery majority, shareholder assumes control ahead of historic IPO." "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking. He felt a desperate need for comfort, for someone to tell him they would rebuild together. Vanessa didn't even stop packing. She didn't look at him with the adoring, wide-eyed gaze she usually reserved for public galas. She looked panicked, angry, and incredibly calculating. "I'm leaving, Harrison. My friend at Kensington's office just texted me. He said the board is already drafting a civil lawsuit against you for breach of fiduciary duty regarding the IP concealment. They're going to freeze your accounts." "Vanessa, stop!" Harrison pleaded, stepping toward her. "I still have money. I have offshore accounts. We can go to St. Bart's. We can lay low until this blows over." She zipped the first suitcase shut with a harsh, tearing sound. "Offshore accounts? Harrison, Madeline's new legal team just filed an emergency injunction. They're freezing everything under suspicion of embezzlement during your tenure as CEO. You don't have offshore accounts anymore. You have nothing." She grabbed her designer purse, slipping past him without a second glance. The absolute lack of hesitation was a physical blow. "I loved you," Harrison shouted after her as she hurried down the marble staircase. Vanessa paused at the front door. She looked back at him, her expression a mix of pity and disgust. "You loved the fact that I made you look young and powerful, and I loved the fact that you were a billionaire. But you aren't a billionaire anymore, Harrison. You're a liability." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the massive, empty mansion. Harrison collapsed onto the edge of the California king bed. For the first time in his life, the silence of his enormous wealth did not feel like a luxury. It felt like a tomb. 6 months later, the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange was a temple of chaotic, electrifying noise. But the private viewing balcony above the frantic sea of blue-jacketed traders was entirely serene. Madeline stood inches from the historic brass bell, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal Armani suit. Today, Gallagher Dynamics was officially dead. In its place, Apex Dynamics was born. The opening bell ceremony had been a master class in quiet dominance. When the market opened, the stock price didn't just climb, it violently surged. Within 2 hours of trading, the initial $3 billion valuation set by the Goldman Sachs underwriters had shattered, rocketing past $5 billion. Madeline had not floundered in her new role. She had immediately purged the toxic executive culture Harrison had fostered, promoting the actual, overworked engineers who had built the chimera algorithm. She proved to be a ruthless, brilliantly efficient CEO. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer, undeniable gravity of her intellect and the absolute leverage she held commanded instant, unwavering respect from the board. Arthur Pendleton stood respectfully to her right, a quiet guardian of the corporate empire they had brilliantly secured. 30 blocks north, a freezing, unforgiving November rain battered the grimy windows of a basement apartment in Queens. The $15 million Westport mansion was gone, seized by federal authorities the moment the fraud investigation went public. The bespoke Brioni suits and the Maybach had been liquidated to pay retainers for a team of defense attorneys who were currently losing a very public, very humiliating battle to keep Harrison out of a federal penitentiary. Harrison sat on the edge of a sagging, moth-eaten mattress, staring blankly at a mountain of legal discovery documents. The walls of his cramped room seemed to be closing in. He had spent his entire morning in a sterile deposition room, enduring 6 hours of relentless cross-examination by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The venture capital firms he had courted for years, titans of industry who used to invite him to their private islands, were now leading a massive class-action lawsuit against him for gross fiduciary negligence and intellectual property fraud. Even Vanessa, the young woman he had proudly paraded in front of Madeline, had quickly turned state's evidence, trading her testimony about Harrison's document, shredding for absolute legal immunity. He was entirely, devastatingly alone. Shivering in the damp chill of the poorly heated room, Harrison reached into the pocket of his faded second-hand coat. His fingers brushed against a small, velvet box. It was the only item he had managed to smuggle out of his former life before the federal marshals locked the doors. He opened the lid. The harsh glare of the single, bare light bulb overhead caught the dull, unconvincing sparkle of the fake moissanite ring. The same ring Madeline had dropped into his cold coffee at the Starlight Diner. He had fished it out of the grease, a pathetic, desperate attempt to hold on to a final symbol of his shattered ego. Now, it was his only remaining physical asset. His stomach gave a hollow, painful growl. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. Swallowing the last bitter dregs of his pride, Harrison zipped his thin coat against the biting wind and walked out into the torrential rain. He needed to survive the week. 2 blocks away, the neon sign of a rundown pawn shop buzzed incessantly, bleeding a sickly red light onto the wet asphalt. Harrison pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell chiming a tinny, mocking note. He approached the scratched glass counter and slid the velvet box toward the pawnbroker. "It's a beautiful platinum setting," Harrison lied, his voice raspy and broken. "I just need $100 for it." The pawnbroker didn't even pick up his jeweler's loupe. He glanced down at the ring, then looked up at the small, flickering television mounted in the corner of the shop. A live broadcast from Bloomberg Television filled the screen. There, standing on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, surrounded by cheering investors, was Madeline. Her face was calm, powerful, and utterly untouchable. Beneath her, the ticker tape confirmed Apex Dynamics as the most successful tech launch of the century. The pawnbroker looked back at Harrison, his eyes filled with a mixture of sudden recognition and profound pity. "I know who you are, buddy. And I saw the financial blogs about how you tried to screw over your wife with that exact ring." He pushed the velvet box back across the scratched glass. "It's worthless glass. I wouldn't give you $10 for it. Get out of my shop." Harrison stood frozen, the sounds of the pawn shop fading into a deafening, suffocating silence. He looked from the worthless fake diamond to the screen broadcasting the triumph of the woman he had discarded. The universe had collected its debt with terrifying precision. He had tried to bury her in the dirt, completely unaware she was a seed. Now she owned the sun, and he was left permanently in the dark, clutching the very fake he had used to deceive her. The scales of justice rarely balance themselves so perfectly, But when absolute arrogance meets quiet, underestimated resilience, the resulting collision is magnificent. Harrison built a kingdom on a foundation of deceit, viewing devotion as a weakness and loyalty as a depreciating asset. He engineered a brutal separation designed to leave an innocent woman broken and destitute. Instead, his meticulously planned betrayal became the precise instrument of his own annihilation. Madeline's journey from a discarded, penniless spouse to the commanding architect of a multi-billion-dollar empire is a testament to the fatal flaw of narcissism. Those who assume they are untouchable are always the most blind to their own vulnerabilities. The universe demands a strict accounting for profound cruelty. In the end, the woman who walked away with absolutely nothing proved that truth, patience, and unwavering resolve are the most devastating weapons of all.